acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I pay my respects to all Indigenous people participating in the webinar today, those in our audience and those who might listen to the webinar recording after the event. I acknowledge that First Nations people have cared for and nurtured these beautiful lands for centuries, and that sovereignty was never ceded over this land, and that this was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I've just got some housekeeping rules. First of all, if you can follow those, mute your sound and image. And if you do have questions and comments as the webinar unfolds, you can add those to the chat function at any time, and that chat function box is going to be actively monitored, and we will, as moderators, pick up on your questions in the time slots that we have for discussion today. So I'm really delighted to be co-moderating this webinar with Angus from UNICEF. This is a partnership today with the Diplomacy Training Programme, Youth Law Australia, Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, and UNICEF. And we have an absolutely fantastic panel and hour and a half ahead of us today. Our focus is going to be on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, listening to our panel of young people's voices and perspectives on issues that really matter and issues that are of concern for them and for their peers in Australia and beyond. We have representation also from the Pacific on our panel today. So I would like to get quickly started because we have a wonderful lineup. I'm going to introduce each young person. They're going to speak, and then I'll then introduce our next speaker in turn, and that's how today will be structured. Please do pop your questions and comments into the chat function box, and Angus from UNICEF will also be monitoring that and then moderating a question and answer and discussion session today. So our first speaker is Gavin from Amnesty's Youth Advisory Group. He is based here in Australia. He's 21 years old. He's completing his Bachelor of Laws and Biomedical Science at Monash University. And he joined Amnesty's international group as a representative last year and was appointed as an Amnesty International Global Youth spokesperson. He's really passionate about human rights and has been involved in lots of campaigning for constitutional recognition of First Nations Australians on issues that are impacting asylum seekers through visa application processes. And also he's been working really hard to raise awareness surrounding climate-related legal challenges that are being brought by those in the Torres Strait Islands. So over to you, Gavin. Thank you for being our first speaker today.
Thank you, Faith, and what an honor it is to speak here today. And I just want to take everyone back to last year, late last year. So in September 2022, a 22-year-old Iranian, Mahsa Amini, died while in police custody. Her death shocked the nation, and it sparked a lot of outrage, and we've seen this outrage in the protests which continue today. Now, a lot of these people partaking in these protests are actually young people. In a New York Times report, it was found that the average age of protesters in some regions were actually 15. Amnesty released a report last month detailing the brutal and unjustified killing of 44 children who partook in these protests. This number has only risen. Now, as a party to the Convention of the Rights of the Child, Iran has obligations under international human rights law to stop its actions. In particular, under Article 6, which describes how every child has an inherent right to life, and Article 13, which describes how every child has the right to freedom of expression. Now, what exactly can Australia do here? Well, Australia has been doing a bit already. Australia played a key role in ensuring that Iran was removed from the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Furthermore, a lot of members of parliament have been engaging with the Iranian community, sponsoring individuals and raising awareness of the plight that they're currently facing. But I think the Australian government can do more. And I think it can do two key things. Firstly, I think the Australian government should make true on its commitments to increase refugee intake. In the Amnesty report I mentioned earlier, a lot of the children that were killed senselessly also had family that were sent death threats. These death threats were designed to basically keep families silent and not speak up against the regime. I think the Australian government must increase refugee intake to allow for these people to seek refuge because they're faced with such difficult living conditions. I think the second thing that the Australian government can do is to consider whether or not it respects the right to protest itself, and in particular, the New South Wales government. As I'm sure a lot of you know, last year, the New South Wales government enforced legislation, harsh protest legislation, which had a maximum penalty of $22,000 or 2 years imprisonment for protesters in New South Wales. As child and youth protesters, I can speak for myself that I can't afford $22,000. But young people are facing a multitude of crises in this day and age. I mean, sure, the climate crisis is the most obvious, but what about the cost of living crisis? What about the geopolitical crisis that we might see in the next decade? I think young people are not okay with the status quo, and they should be allowed to speak out about it, particularly if they're doing so in a non-violent way. I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has any.
Gavin, thank you so much. You raised so many issues that people are experiencing at the moment, and really significant local and international concerns. We might move on to our next speaker, and people can feel free to populate the chat box with reflections on what Gavin and our other speakers are raising in their speeches today. And also we have lots of room for discussion to pick up on these issues in the second part of the webinar today. Thank you so much, Gavin, for kickstarting these really important discussions today. So we now have another Amnesty Youth Advisory Group representative, Tahlia, who sits on the Amnesty International's Australia Youth Advisory Group as one of the representatives for Victoria. She is an Amnesty staff member as the organisation's youth membership officer, and through her various roles in Amnesty, she mobilises other youth activists, generates youth-driven change, and advocates for youth to be included in all decisions that impact their future. And as a youth activist, she is the founder and president of Solidarity Tea at UNIMELB, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, at the student-run organisation who are fighting for change in the refugee crisis. And she's received a Global Citizenship Award to support her humanitarian work in Nepal, and was the conference facilitator for an initiative for peace, civil rights and social action conference in Thailand. So really pleased to have you speaking here today, Tahlia. So over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Faith, for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to speak here today. So today I would like to speak about the absolutely unacceptable treatment of refugee children and children seeking asylum and migrant children here in the system that Australia has created. So as those of you know, in the 2019 concluding observations, it was actually highlighted that there were some really, really concerning issues to do with the treatment of this particular group of children. And it was actually the longest and lengthiest section in this report. And I think that really speaks to how today's system hasn't really addressed any of these recommendations or these areas of concern that were highlighted in the 2019 report. It's also really important to note that this is not just a problem here in Australia, but in the news this week, we actually saw that over 200 unaccompanied children have been missing in UK in a system that is actually created to protect them, or should be created to protect them, and allow them to exercise their right to seek asylum and protection. And so this is really, really concerning and is a major violation to children's rights that are enshrined in the CRC. And so we know that here in Australia, we have a very, very damaging, harmful and inhumane system for seeking asylum. And that's largely to do with the offshore processing policy that allows people seeking asylum and children seeking asylum to be processed offshore in Nauru or Manus Island, and largely creates a limbo that they're stuck in for could be over 10 years. And so what we see is that children and children seeking asylum are placed in these really harmful detention centres and processing centres. And not only is this inhumane and damaging for adults, but this is even more damaging for children who are vulnerable to these conditions. And these conditions include a lack of access to food and water, overcrowded living conditions, poor hygiene and sanitation, and most concerning of all, but a lack of adequate medical and health services. And what this actually creates is cascading effects on children's lives and their ability to enjoy their human rights enshrined to them in the CRC. And so not only is this a direct violation of Article 22 from the CRC, which is the right to protection of refugee children, but also this leads to a violation to a lot of other rights, including the right to access education, mental health services, physical health services, freedom of discrimination, freedom of violence and abuse as well. And we've actually seen that manifested recently in the news with the Biloela family. And for those of you who are not familiar, but the 4-year-old Tamil Sri Lankan daughter, Thanika, actually was diagnosed with pneumonia and sepsis. And that's due to the condition that she was subject to in her detention centre in Christmas Island. And so what we see here is that children like Thanika and her sister and the hundreds of other refugee children and children seeking asylum have got health conditions and health problems due to these prison-like camps that they're subject to. And so what I'm demanding from the federal government is that, yes, like Gavin mentioned, the Labor government has promised an increase in the humanitarian intake program. They've also promised an increase in the community sponsor refugee program, but actually this is not enough. We need to create a system that is actually in the best interest of the child, and that can begin with amending the Migration Act to ensure that no children or their families are subject to detention or these these asylum-seeking processing processes. And in addition to that, I also think it's really important that we address the children that have been subject to these conditions for the last over 10 years and offer them support, whether that be resettled in Australia or overseas. And just remember that a child is a child no matter their immigration status. And yeah, that's all from me for now. Thank you, Faith.
Thank you so much, Tahlia, for raising so many important issues, for reminding us of what the government have signed up to in relation to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and also, calling for more accountability in that space. So thank you so much. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and discussion points that will flow from the really important issues that you have raised in your speech today as well. I would now like to move on to our next speaker, Abbey from the Amnesty Youth Advisory Group as well. Abbey's been a youth advocate for 2 years with Amnesty, and in that time she has found a real passion in advocating for the rights of young people who are marginalised and those who are the victims of domestic and family violence. And those passions are also supported by her studies of criminology and criminal justice, alongside all of the range of other volunteer positions and roles that Abbey has. So thank you, Abbey, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Faith, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm really glad to be here with such an amazing array of young activists, no matter what their, I guess, passions are. But today I'm going to just quickly touch on the raising the age of criminal responsibility across Australia. So when we talk about the age of criminal responsibility, we're really talking about, based on legislation and the criminal justice system, what age is considered to be able to know the crimes that they've committed and that they were wrong, and also face criminal charges. So currently in Australia, all states and territories have a minimum age of 10 years old. And this is quite low compared to a lot of other countries, which typically are around 14 years of age. This is set out because most of children that age don't have the mental capacity to understand what their actions and the consequences of those actions. And when we talk about the CRC Committee and the CRC itself, they're kind of putting out to put a standard across all countries to have 14 years and up. That's just so that children 14 and below can't be imprisoned, can't be placed with adult prisoners, and also the power to arrest and strip search as well. So there's a bit of a misconception across Australia that the age of criminal responsibility is 14. So 2 out of 3 people actually believe that it is 14 at this stage, but really it is 10 years of age, which is quite low, as I said before. Sorry, just let me get where I'm up to. So studies have shown that the younger that children are when they're encountering the justice system, the more likely that they are to reoffend. So recidivism rates are greater because these children are entering so young when their minds aren't fully, aren't able to conceptualize what they're doing and what their actions and their consequences. So this current legislation also creates major issues for marginalised communities such as Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander children. This is because that they are already marginalised communities and also disproportionately impacted, make up the vast majority of imprisoned children as well. So Indigenous children are locked up 17 times the rate of non-Indigenous children, and that is quite shocking since the amount of children in Australia, only 6% of them are Indigenous children. So it is quite surprising to hear that they make up such a large majority because of the low population rate of Indigenous communities and Indigenous children. So what we're kind of asking the government to do is to look at the current criminal age of responsibility and raise it from 10 to 14 so that children have the ability to get that mental capacity and mental ability to understand what their actions are before putting them in a jail with older people who tend to kind of make them grow up in a way that isn't effective, and they don't get that childhood as well. So what you can do to help is pretty much sign petitions, engage with your MPs, host educational events, sort of like this one today, and kind of just make people aware that the age of criminal responsibility isn't 14, but it is actually 10. That means that children in the years 3 to 4 are going to jail before they even graduate primary school. So it is quite shocking, and a lot of people don't actually realise. So that's probably the major issue that I want to take people to take away with today, and be aware that sort of our misconception of what the age of criminal responsibility and children here in Australia are getting locked up. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Abbey, for raising that really significant issue. And it also highlights that, you know, it's something that in their reports, the UN committee have highlighted consecutively, you know, and we really need to be seeing a move in all of the states and territories to actually action this and see it being pushed through. It's so vitally important. Thank you for listing out what we can all do individually and collectively to see this much needed change. So thank you for that. I'm sure that topic will come up again later in our discussions. So our next speaker is Jean, who is a climate activist and author and an artist. She founded the Sydney contingent of School Strikes for Climate in 2018 and organised extensively with a group on the local, national and global levels. Jean began her activism at the age of 13 when she volunteered with the Yes campaign for marriage equality. And she's also worked with organisations such as Get Up. And her first book, Lead the Way, was published in March. So I'm really excited to have that added to my summer reading list, Jean. So thank you, and over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Faith. And also just thank you for having me. This is a really interesting roundtable, and I'm really enjoying the conversations we're having. So on the issue of climate, I think that looking at it just from an Australian perspective to start with and around young people, I mean, we've grown up accustomed to a constant stream of unprecedented climate effects. I mean, since 2013, we've experienced 8 of the 10 hottest years on record. Just a few months ago, the country was experiencing devastating floods, with areas in Queensland and New South Wales seeing a year's worth of rain in only 1 week, which inundated thousands of homes and cost billions of dollars in damages. And I mean, this came just 2 years after the Black Summer bushfire crisis, which lasted for 8 months and saw the deaths of over 450 people and 3 billion animals, while burning upwards of 80,000 acres of land. And even just on a personal level, I know my earliest memory of primary school, on one of my first days of kindergarten, we had a gold coin donation for bushfire survivors as a sort of collective school thing. And the way it's been normalized and we've been growing up with these circumstances is deeply, deeply wrong and unjust. This is our normal, and it truly shouldn't be. And as we continue seeing the climate crisis exacerbate and seeing the impacts of this crisis amplify, I think it's important to remember that we don't just deserve to live in a livable world, but we should have one that we can thrive in. Young people, of course, will be seeing the worst impacts of the climate crisis. The younger a person is, the greater impacts they will see in their lifetime and the less of a say they have today. But even within that, we have such a diversity of climate impact that people are seeing. Even just in Sydney, for example, in the inner city, summer is experienced in a much less intense way than, say, in Greater Western Sydney, where due to geographic differences and infrastructure and urban development, extreme heat is far more of a problem. So what we've seen with the most recent Labor government, of course, they are the most ambitious in terms of climate in a very long time, but still they're nowhere near enough. I personally see as the most important with issue regarding climate is that fossil fuels have to stay in the ground, and the Labor government have continued to approve new coal mines, new fossil fuel infrastructure and development. And no government, no leader, I believe, can be serious about the climate crisis, can be serious about solving this if they are still willing to fuel this crisis in a very real material way. What we've seen year after year is sweeping this issue under the rug, paying lip service, saying things will happen, but still our emissions are rising, still the earth is heating. So I think also as part of this, it's quite a fundamental flaw in how our earth operates and how our industry and our way of life operates currently in relationship with the earth. This isn't an issue that happened by accident. This is a deeply, deeply flawed relationship. It will take widespread societal change. It's not just a matter of implementing renewables. We need to reevaluate our relationship with the earth and understand that we can't continue taking and never giving back. And in terms of the rights of children, continued climate inaction is clearly infringing on children's rights, the right to life, the right to health, the right to culture, the right to having a standard of living adequate for a child's physical, mental, spiritual, moral, and social development. Yeah, and I think that as part of the process of taking this action, it's really important to have young people's voices much more officially considered, and give them a platform which is greater than just occasionally listening or paying lip service. I think we need to find ways of officializing a youth voice, whether that's lowering the voting age and taking young people in a much more serious level. So that was quite rambly, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane, for raising these really important issues, and also to make a point about young people and how you've all been mobilizing yourselves to highlight how much of a crisis we're in, to challenge the government to do more. Now, I noticed that Harrison, you had your hand up. Do you want to make a comment?
Awesome. Yeah, so Jean, in the past couple of days, the government has announced that it's going to have, as one of its 5 advisory groups, a group on climate change and COP. What is your sort of perspective? Like, how is this meaningful youth representation? And if not, what would you sort of do to change that?
Unfortunately, I'm not all over the topic at the moment, so I can't be particularly specific, but I think that ensuring that there's a level of accountability to young people and their voices, not just having it be symbolic, ensuring that there are means and systems in place to make sure that these resolutions or whatever they decide upon will actually be implemented and can't just be written off, I would say would be important. I'm sorry, I can't answer more specifically.
That's a really great response. Thanks for the question, Harrison. That was a really topical one, and thanks, Jean, for your response. We did host a webinar a while ago, and it's available on the DTP YouTube channel on participation with an international professor who writes all about participation and developed a model, Professor Lundy. And it's really interesting about the perspectives about how young people can participate and be at the heart of these discussions without it being tokenistic, which I think is what you were touching on, Jane, in your response as well. Thank you so much for that contribution. Lots to pick up on as well in our discussions today. Okay, so next speaker up is Theo, who is a transgender, non-binary writer, activist and performer. Theo is 16 and also a high school student, I should mention. They are deeply passionate about transgender activism with their writings about their trans and Jewish identities. That's been published in The Age. I love The Age. So their other passions include climate change, their Year 11 literature class, and the Academy Awards. So over to you, Theo, and thanks so much for your contribution today as well.
Thank you so much, Faith. Yes, last night, the Oscar noms, it was a big deal for me. I stayed up, so I'm still quite tired. But yes, speaking on quickly those advisory groups, I was really disappointed to see there was no queer advisory group, because I think the government is really lacking in their action on queer rights and for young people. And I was really disappointed by that. But I want to speak today on kind of the rights of queer religiously identifying teenagers, because it can be a really isolating and difficult experience, like especially for me growing up in a Jewish school and a Jewish community. And like, for instance, learning that Genesis 1:28, in the image of God, he created them male and female. And like at my bar mitzvah, the idea of becoming a man, and my dad read this prayer to me in front of everyone. I've actually got the quote. It was, "Blessed be he who has released me from being punishable for this boy, now a man." So it's certainly been a really isolating experience at times. And I think that's why the recent religious discrimination bill really heightened the experiences of religiously identifying trans people, because while we've been isolated from our communities in the past, this was a purposeful oppression by the government. And Scott Morrison, I want to highlight some of the ways he broke the UN Convention's right of a child, in my opinion. Actually wrote a few down. So the United Nations Convention's Right of a Child, which was ratified by Australia in December 1990, states in Article 28 that children have the right to an education. Scott Morrison, through the religious discrimination bill and claiming that trans children like me could be expelled from my school simply based on my gender identity, that is just a simple breaking of my right to an education. And Article 31 states that children have the right to relax, play, and to join in a wide range of leisure activities. People like me were extremely stressed and distressed by this news, and having to watch our fundamental rights debated in the media was really distressing for me and really worrying, because while I can take that on, having been already through the marriage equality bill and all of it, 10-year-old children going to some religious school that don't have access to that but feel like there is something off about them, watching this debated in the media and by their government who is meant to protect them, would just be heartbreaking, and it really makes me really sad. And also simply Article 32 states that governments should protect children. Scott Morrison, furthermore, the LNP broke every one of these articles in their attempts to shove the religious discrimination bill into law. He was denying my right to an education, my right to relax, and due to the worry of expulsion from school, and he was in no way protecting me. And while now that Scott Morrison is gone, Anthony Albanese and the Labor government had made no attempt at LGBT rights. I mean, Anthony Albanese gave an interview saying that men can't have children. Like, they're not trying. They're not investing into the government funding that we need. For example, I've had to wait 1.5 years for an appointment with the gender clinic that is owned by the government. We need more funding, we need more protection, and our fundamental rights shouldn't be debated in the media, period. If you have any questions, pop them in the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Theo, and thank you for sharing your personal experience and also highlighting what you want to see change for other children and young people who may well be experiencing these challenges in accessing services and having their voices heard. So thank you so much. Again, so much to pick up on there in our discussions in the second half of the webinar. So thank you so much. I'll move on now to our next speaker, Tom. Tom is a lead facilitator at YACVIC, and there's lots of topics that Tom is interested in, like civics education. Tom comes from a regional area in which young people have statistically had some of the worst outcomes across the state and the country as a whole. And he talks a lot about being really grateful for the opportunity to represent young people who have come from communities like his, and he wants to share the experiences of what the reality is like for young people from those communities when dealing with the government and other organisations, and also the perceptions of how the government and other organisations, what those perceptions are when they're working with young people. So thank you, Tom, and over to you now.
Howdy everyone, can people hear me? Perfect, awesome. So hi everyone, my name's Tom. I'm currently on Wurundjeri country, but I'm originally from Yorta Yorta country up north in regional Victoria. So to tell you a little bit about myself, or what I'm going to be talking about today. So late last year, my town experienced a pretty bad event. And because we have a lot of policymakers in this virtual room, I'd really like to talk about some of the learnings that have come from this, particularly because some of these learnings really come from how government treats and works with young people. So late last year, there was a lot of floods across Australia. My town was particularly hit pretty hard. And it was also, it had some of the worst floods that the country had seen. A number of people actually died in the surrounding areas, and lots of displaced people and homelessness was a result in, my hometown and the surrounding areas as well. While there was a lot of immediate support, even had the military going through town with like big armored vehicles, big military helicopters and things like that were literally saving lives. After this kind of immediate, like evacuation, those kind of things, there was the trying to move on to the how do we recover and how do we kind of build back again. In terms of the conversations that was had with the community, there was really a lot of key cohorts that missed out, particularly for young people. So the support that was available there was just not accessible for young people. So, trying to get a public servant to navigate a Services Australia website is difficult enough. Trying to get a young person to navigate it when this is probably their first time dealing with government is just virtually impossible. Especially when there's, there could be language barriers, there could just be not understanding what different government ID documents are that's needed, and trying to get evidence when your home is literally surrounded by water and you're trying to fill sandbags or whatever. It's just not your top priority, and it's not easy to do. So a lot of people gave up on getting support that way, particularly young people. A second key learning is that without the key consultations and communications with young people, government just didn't really know where the problems were for young people. And because of that, a lot of young people missed out, and there was a lot of policy gaps that developed. So something that I saw as an example of this was after the floods and after the water had subsided a lot, I had the opportunity to go to a lot of local schools and actually talk with young people that had experienced this. Something that I kept hearing similar stories about how, they didn't know what support was out there and that it also wasn't enough. There was also policy gaps that began to develop and tell a story. One of these key stories that I heard was there was a local young person, I believe they're in about year 10. They and their family were trying to support another family who were asylum seekers and refugees and had only been in the country for about a month before the floods happened. This family had 5 children, 2 parents, brand new to the country, only been living here for about a month. But because they were so new to the country and because of how the current support policies were set up, they pretty much weren't eligible for any support from the government. So you've got these 5 young people, brand new to a country, language difficulties and all these kind of things. This kind of flood comes through, wipes out the town, and there's no support for them because the government isn't actually talking to them. And at the time I talked with this young peer person, this other family was living homeless out of a local mosque. And it's really freaky to be hearing about these things and hearing and learning about these things in the media in other countries. But it seems ridiculous when you hear about it so close to your home and so close to people you're actually directly talking to. So probably 2 key learnings for government, I think, is whenever we're providing support and working and engaging with young people, we need to do better to make it accessible. And secondly, we need to be moving past this tokenistic, any consultations with young people just to tick a box. And we really need to be moving forward with how do we actually directly empower people to make the decisions for themselves, particularly when there are, key issues that'll impact them. So I really think we need to be moving forward into this past consultation and directly to empowerment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tom, for sharing the experiences of the community in which you're from, for going out and engaging and speaking with young people to collect that evidence of their lived experiences in order to highlight to the decision makers what needs to change should a natural disaster like that occur again. And you've given 2 really important change points that we need to see happen. Thank you so much for that, and so much connection with what some of our other speakers said as well. I'm sure again this will come up in our discussions in more detail as well. So thank you for your speech. I'm keeping to time, which is good, and everyone's being so amazing at keeping to their time. So thank you to all of the speakers for that. You're all so professional. Harrison is our next speaker. Harrison is a UNICEF Australia Young Ambassador, a really passionate youth advocate about technology and society. Harrison's studying a double degree in advanced computing, research and development, and politics, philosophy and economics, specialising in machine learning here at the Australian National University. And as a UNICEF Australia Young Ambassador, he's working to ensure that young people's voices are at the forefront of the national conversation and advises government on how to build a better, safer internet for young people as a member of the e-Safety Commissioners Youth Council. And in his spare time, he leads logistics. Do you have spare time, Harrison? Wow. You lead logistics and strategy for the ANU solar racing. So like all of our speakers, incredibly busy. I am just blown away by everything that you all do. So over to you, Harrison, and thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you so much, Faith. I'd like to begin by acknowledging I'm in Jabberkai country up in far north Queensland. I apologize if I drop out at any particular point. My internet's a little bit not great at the moment. So I have a couple slides just to sort of make my point. So today I'm sort of talking about the urban region divide between your metropolitan areas, Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, and all of that, and pretty much everywhere else. So here's a bit of a map of Australia. As you can see, there's a lot of Australia that is classified as inner regional and outer regional. Oh dear. Have I frozen? No. Can you guys see that? Just a little bit closer. Examples of inner regional cities include Toowoomba, Bundaberg, Rockhampton. Outer regional in Cairns, close to where I am at the moment. And then as you go down, you get more and more isolated communities. In terms of young people's perspectives, about 25% or 1 in 4 of Australian young people live in an inner regional, outer regional, or remote, very remote area, which when you think about it is quite a substantial amount of young people. One of the things about living in a regional community, apart from we've been very fortunate up here to not have anywhere near as bad climate events such as what Tom was just speaking about, but rather you still have a lot of less opportunities relative to metropolitan counterparts. So for myself, for example, there were plenty of different events that you'd sort of see online as you're scrolling through Instagram, like model UN competitions or advocacy opportunities that claimed for them to represent all of Queensland, but required people to attend meetings in person in Brisbane. For those unaware, Cairns to Brisbane, just here, is the same distance as Brisbane to Melbourne, to give you an idea just of the scale that we're dealing with when we're talking about rural regional communities and young people in these communities. For comparison, Toowoomba is an hour and a half out of Adelaide, of Brisbane rather, and for Victorians, that's the same as Ballarat to Melbourne. What this means is that there's a financial as well as a geographic barrier to participating in many of the opportunities that metropolitan young people might get access to. Once you factor in flights, not being able to return home, so you have to spend more on accommodation, it makes it non-viable in Queensland, particularly for most people outside of Southeast Queensland. When it comes to scholarships and other opportunities, which might be on merit, this puts puts regional students behind their metro peers simply because of where they grew up. So you can kind of imagine my delight in 2020 when some events that would normally be held online that would normally rather be held in person went online. Unfortunately, as soon as they could, they were put back in person, cutting them off from rural and regional young people yet again. So really, there's sort of an issue here. Like lots of organizations put dealing with regional students into the too hard basket. But at the same time, like we have to fight a lot of these systematic barriers put in place as regional students that metropolitan students might not have to care about as much. One of my close friends, they grew up about an hour and a half away from me, further in regional Queensland. Their school didn't have the teachers to be able to run chemistry classes. And the only way that they could run the maths courses required to get into a STEM degree at university was by bending Queensland education requirements slightly, just so that way these couple of students were able to actually get into uni. Their school dropped from 5 days a week to 4 days a week simply because they just didn't have the resources to be able to offer a school for those complete 5-day weeks. Those who want to go to university, to become doctors, to become nurses, to become teachers, to become engineers, have to push harder against a system that entrenches this urban regional divide. So there's plenty of different solutions here, and there's a lot of people in the policy space far more knowledgeable than I am to cover these. But as long as we're now sort of starting to think about how we can address this divide, I'm sure that there's going to be plenty more solutions to come out with working with young people right across regional Australia.
Thank you so much, Harrison, for highlighting those issues and the experiences of young people living in regional and rural areas. Lots of crossover as well, I think, from what Tom highlighted also. And, you mentioned there a lot about education. This also impacts on health, access to services, access to justice, and and in the family violence space too. So there's so many issues there that access to services are unreliable, inaccessible. So you're highlighting so many important points in what you're raising there. Again, a lot of this I'm sure our participants and audience will have questions and discussion points later in the session today. So thank you very much for your contribution. Zara is going to speak next. Zara is a UNICEF Australia Young Ambassador. She's a proud Lutherita, and again, I apologise if I've pronounced that incorrectly. Woman from Tasmania who's currently living in Canberra, studying international relations, minoring in Asian Pacific Studies here at the Australian National University. Zara's really passionate about Indigenous issues and also social justice. And she works hard to create opportunities for communities in regional and rural areas, and helps raise the voices of young people. And Zara really hopes that every child can grow up and have the same opportunity as each other, and that each other's culture and heritage and diversity can really be seen as a strength and not as a weakness. So thank you so much, Zara, for your contribution today, and over to you.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's such an honour to be here and a privilege to be among all these amazing young people. I'd like to first pay my respects to the land I'm on, which is the Ngunnawal land here in Canberra. And I also would like to pay my support and warm wishes to any other Indigenous young people here today or listening in future. I know this time of year is really, really difficult. And today I'm going to be talking about Indigenous issues here in Australia. And as an Indigenous woman, this is normally quite daunting. So sorry if it sounds like I'm choking up, but it's just a very important issue I'm very passionate about. So I'm from Lutruwita, otherwise known as Tasmania. My home clan is known as Tomajeen land up in north of Tasmania. If you looked at the map of Tasmania, it's right in the middle up north. I'm very proud to be from there. But what I would really love to talk about today is talking about Article 2 in the Conventions of the Rights for the Child, where states and parties shall take all appropriate measures to ensure that the child is protected against all forms of discrimination or punishment. As an Indigenous person growing up, you face discrimination as soon as you go to school. I'm sure many of you in your education haven't actually learned much about Indigenous culture or the true history of this country, which is really quite sad and honestly is just not acceptable anymore. And I hope this is changing, and I really appreciate young people who go out of their way to do research and whatnot, but I believe that it should already be there. And I think this is a fundamental issue that's our state, from federal and state governments, have gotten very, very wrong in pretty much just ignoring the history and the discourse you face in media. From a very young age, I remember once it hit January 1st, my mum made sure we didn't watch the news until tomorrow, essentially, just because it's very, very hard to witness, and just the conversations about Indigenous rights, people, the stereotypes. It's really a lot to take in mentally every year. And as soon as any issue pops up, which is probably once a week, the discourse around that is very, very hard to deal with on a constant basis. This year we saw Cassius Turvey's life tragically be stolen from him in the senseless act of violence where he was walking home from school and was beaten to death by a metal pole. And that was, we can really see that racism is very much thriving in this country. And I often, when people are asking me questions about my Indigenous heritage and from being from Litchfield, I often get, oh, surely they don't exist. They, as in Aboriginal people from Tasmania. And I often get quite frustrated and think, oh, how can people be this naive? But I also sit back and realize they've never had the opportunity, nor were ever given the opportunity to learn where they should have been learnt this in their schooling and whatnot. So I think this is a really fundamental issue that our government and our education systems and everything we do, all of our systems, really needs to focus on education for Indigenous people, because we can't keep living like this. It's very hard. Yesterday, the ABC released that the most pedestrian deaths in the country was in the Northern Territory, and that most, actually all the deaths in the Northern Territory were of Indigenous people, and they had the most in the country. And there's been links to racism with a lot of this. And I really encourage everyone, especially this time of year, to go out and do as much research as they can. I always encourage to go to your local Indigenous centres, especially if they're youth centres. It's really great to talk to young Indigenous people, because I'm just a voice. My voice doesn't represent all Indigenous young people. But yeah, I think this is something our government and ourselves really need to change in future. But once again, thank you so much for having me here today. It's been such a pleasure, and I've loved what everyone said so far. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Zara, for all of the learning for everyone in what you spoke about today, and also for showing such grace in terms of giving us something proactive that we can go and do in terms of encouraging people to do research, and not blaming people for their lack of knowledge, and really speaking to what needs to change in terms of systems and education. So thank you so much. Again, you've raised so much in your speech today for us to talk about later. So thank you so much for your contribution. We've now got our next speaker, Josaia from the Fiji Council of Social Services. He's a humanitarian project officer. And Josaia, you might want to say a bit more about yourself and the full range of all of the work that you're involved in. So over to you, and thank you for your contribution in the session today.
Thank you, Faith, and thanks as well to the organizers for this webinar. Bulawanak and Pacific greetings from Suva, and I'm so fortunate to be part of this webinar, and my sincere acknowledgement as well to my employer for allowing me to be part of this discussion, the Fiji Council of Social Services, on the nomination from the Pacific Youth Council. I'm part of the Pacific Youth Council as a technical advisor to youth governance and leadership. But my day job right now is knowledge management officer, which ties in most of the development work that we have within our organization across the nation in Fiji, and also in partnership. One of the piece of work that I hold dear recently is the work around localization, not only in Fiji but also in the Pacific. So less of me and enough of me. I just want to place on the record my sincere gratitude for the great deliberations on experiences and learnings, and some of the recommendations, powerful ones, that have come from the young leaders who have spoken before me. And I'm just wondering, what is my contribution after this? My only ground experience of Australia has been the few days of conference and meetings, which always happen at the CBDs. And I've learned a lot about Australia in the last few minutes, and I'm so looking forward for at least a trip or two down to the outbacks or even to the regional states of Australia. However, my contribution today as a friend of Australia and also as a beneficiary of trades agreements and development aids from Australia would be around recommendation 16 of the UN CRC's concluding observations on the combined 5th and 6th periodic report regarding international corporations. I must first acknowledge and express our thanks to the Australian government for their support not only to Fiji but across the Pacific through numbers of trade agreements and development aids. And I must say that I'm currently working on one of those development aids agreements, which is under the Australian Humanitarian Partnership with the Pacific. On the report, the committee recommends that the state party adopt a child right-based approach in respect to its trade agreements and development aid policies and programs. In addition to that, on behalf of the young people of the Pacific who nominate me to be their representative, we strongly recommend that not only a child right-based approach, but a more family-centered approach that encapsulate the right and safety of children in program designs, delivery, and evaluations of any trade agreement and development aid policy and programs that are churned out of Australia. Let me just share a bit on one of our experience regarding these trade agreements, in particular, the Fiji-Australia Vuvale Partnership. While the agreement has been successful so far, since 2019, there are a few gaps worth noting, especially when it comes to the safety of children involved. In some instances, both parents have to leave their children behind in the care of their grandparents or relative as they take up non-seasonal work opportunities in Australia for up to 3 or 4 years or even beyond. While parents made the ultimate sacrifice to work in a foreign land to support their family better, the story here on the ground is not always favorable. We have incidents where the intended support or the promised support for the children who are left behind in the care of their relatives either did not arrive or arrived late than expected from the carers. This increased the vulnerability of children, especially on safeguarding issues, which might include child trafficking and child labor, among others. Therefore, our humble plea and ask to the government of Australia and Fiji to revise the Vuvale Partnership Agreement in a true spirit of Vuvale. Vuvale is a Fijian word of family. So in the true spirit of family, to allow parents to travel with their children as a family to Australia in the length or part thereof of that contract, to allow children as well to enjoy the full benefit of this agreement. This is not only for the Vuvale agreement. Our prayer is for any trade agreements that Australia will have with Pacific countries to allow, if parents are to travel to Australia, to allow a family benefit together with that as well. Just to conclude on my very short deliberations, child right-based approach and family-centered approach should never be a negotiable. It should be a non-negotiable factor and has to be at the heart of all program design, delivery, and evaluations for any trade agreements or development aid policy and programs for the Australian government or any government in this case, including ours in the Pacific and Fiji. Thank you for Exia, Malo, Whakawhatai, Tango Tumas, Kiniso, Korapa, and Vinaka Wagalevu from the Pacific Youth Council and the Fiji Council of Social Services.
Josaia, thank you so much for your contribution. Your last statement was extremely powerful and speaks right to the heart of a lot of what we've been talking about today, what, as a collective, you've all been raising about how children and young people's experiences, voices and perspectives should be at the very heart of everything that governments, policymakers, decision makers should be doing. So thank you so much. Before I hand over to Angus, I'd like to acknowledge that we were to have another speaker, Josh, from the Pacific Islands students fighting climate change. He's the vice president. Unfortunately, Josh couldn't make it at the last moment, but I'd like to acknowledge all of Josh's contributions in the preparations for today, in his contribution in meeting the other young people, in preparing for today's discussions, and all of the really important points that he made during those interactions, and all of the work that Josh is involved with. We really hope that Josh can be involved in another webinar at another stage. So a shout out to Josh to say thanks, and to we hope all is okay. Okay, so I am now delighted to hand over to the wonderful Angus from UNICEF, who is going to kickstart some of our discussions, who's been keeping an eye on the chat box, and yeah, it'll be great to interact with some of the audience's key questions today. So thank you to everyone, and over to Angus.
Thank you so much, Faith. Hi everyone, I'm Angus. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Child and Youth Engagement Manager at UNICEF Australia. Just acknowledge that I'm on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that to any First Nations people here today, and yeah, joining us today. And thank you particularly to Zara for the strength that you showed in sharing your experiences. It was incredibly powerful, particularly as you mentioned at this time of year, and how challenging that is for First Nations communities and people. And obviously going into tomorrow and this year being the having the voice referendum, obviously us as a community of social justice people who work with young people, should be getting around that as much as possible, and ensuring that we are finally acknowledging the ongoing custodianship and celebrating our First Nations people. So thank you. I am very excited and lucky to be here. I am fortunate enough that I get to work with young people almost every day. So I feel very privileged all the time to be able to hear the amazing things that they have to say. And I think most people here would be able to agree that the people that we've had today and other young people are already leading the way. I really hate when people say young people are the leaders of the future. I think they probably dislike it more than I do. I think it undervalues the incredible contribution that they are already providing to communities around Australia, and the ideas and the passion they're able to harvest and move us all collectively forward is far greater than any leaders that I see of now, so-called. So I look forward to the day that you're all in Parliament and running the country, because that would be a better day for all of us. And it would just be remiss of me not to say also UNICEF Australia is really proud to be a partner on this webinar. Obviously, we work across the world with children in a lot of disaster areas, but we also work within Australia, which is often unknown, trying to work with marginalised communities across Australia and highlighting the voices of children and young people. Very fortunate that Harrison and Zara are two of our incredible young ambassadors, and small plug, we'll be having the applications opening in the next couple of months for the next round of young ambassadors. So you may be able to get to work with me and the wonderful team in the future. So thank you. Questions. So please continue to pop them into the chat. And also, if you would like to actually ask one yourself directly, you can use the raise the hand function, which is down the bottom in the reactions, and then I can go to you. The first question that I saw, and Gavin, you did kind of respond in the chat, but I think it would be interesting just to throw it to any young person who may have anything to respond to about the current crises. We call a lot of things crises as well, but the cost of living and housing situation, particularly for young people, particularly for lower income people. I mean, a lot of communities are really struggling with this, but wondering if any of you had any suggestions or thoughts on what we could be doing better to address some of these issues relating to that. Jean, and then I will jump to the next question, Mariah, afterwards as well.
I think something that's really important is housing, especially renters, and that's particularly for young people. I think that it just makes common sense to introduce a rent freeze for a bit, to have better rights for tenants, to implement better laws around evictions, especially fair cause evictions, and to do with how much rent can be increased over a certain period of time. So much of our economy is driven by this insane housing market, and the commodification of an essential human right, I just think is deeply flawed. And when you pair that with a market of extreme wealth and the inflation of house prices, you've created this immense wealth divide that is deeply generational and is setting so many young people up for failure. It's just deeply, deeply unjust, I feel.
Thanks, Jane. Gavin, did you want to jump in? I just saw you had your hand in response to this as well.
Yeah, look, it was actually just what Jane said. In addition to what I wrote, I think that there's also a need to have a more comprehensive view, because there have been reports that I've read about the mental health issues that come because of this crisis. I also think that there needs to be greater, there needs to be greater construction to meet that demand as well. And how we go about that is perhaps through education and through TAFE, but also through migrants and stuff like that. And it's just a whole issue that's interlinked with so many other problems that we may face.
Great. Thank you. And just to, I mean, some people may not know this, but it is possible. We don't also just have to ask questions about youth issues. I'm sure the young people in the room are able to answer any policy questions that you have for them as well. So please go ahead. But Mariah, did you have a question that you would like to ask?
My apologies, Angus. I'm very autistic and I misinterpreted what you said. When you said young people, I thought that meant any young people here, not just the actual panel.
If you have a response to that question, please go ahead.
Thank you.
Yes,
I'm
happy
so glad
to hear.
you asked.
Thank you.
Disabled young people are consistently left out when we're listing off and thinking of hot topic issues, social justice issues, marginalized groups of young people and people in general. Absolutely no shame or wrongdoing implied with this webinar. After all, it is remote, and that is a wonderful thing for disabled access. But of course, I do note that with the wonderful diversity and strength of the young people speaking on the discussion on the panel, there were a lot of different mainstream social justice issues brought up, like climate, like Indigenous rights, like queer rights, Pacific development, but nothing about disabled young people, when we are the only marginalised group you can become part of at any time. We are disproportionately impacted intersectionally by the issues that impact all of the other marginalised groups, because we can be part of all of them too, and we are. And I think something that can immediately be done by everybody is to really think about making sure that there are disabled people at the table.
Excellent point, and thank you for sharing, and definitely noted, and something that we can all do better on. So thank you for sharing that with us. Really appreciate it. And I guess to kind of open it up to if there are any other young people who are here today, which I know there are some, which is amazing. If you have anything that you have to say on any of the topics that have been risen or have not, we are very open to hear from you. All of your lived and living experiences are valid and bring a lot to our conversation. So please raise your hand if you would like to as well. Any other questions from the floor, just as I am trawling through the questions on the side from anybody?
Yeah, hi everyone. I was just writing it out and then I thought, no, I'll just say it. It's easier.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Grace, and you guys are amazing, and it's just been wonderful listening to all of the knowledge. And I was just saying about how you've shared some incredible insights into what the situation is for young people in Australia at the moment and for people overseas. My question is around the current issue that's happening in the Northern Territory at the moment. I'm just wondering if any of you have any comments on that with regards to the $14 million that's now been allocated by the federal government to inject more policing into the Alice Springs and Northern Territory community, particularly in light of the Northern Territory intervention in 2007, which created a whole range or a whole gamut of issues for First Nations peoples. And I'm just wondering, as a person that works in the area of education and youth justice, I'm finding it really difficult to work out why the government keeps going for the kind of punitive responses rather than, putting $14 million into community support, which is needed. And I'm just wondering if any of you could comment on that, or your opinions or expertise in that area.
Thanks for the great question, Grace. And I'll throw to you, Zara. And if any other young people want to have a say, please raise your hand as well. Thanks, Zara.
Thanks so much for your question, Grace. And yes, I completely agree. I am someone who's also very passionate about the justice system as well, especially Indigenous justice. And I often think that our federal government definitely goes about justice in a very wrong way. Why spend $14 million on more policing when we know that's going to do more harm in the long term than spending that $40 million in restorative justice or in programs that are going to help Indigenous people. And yeah, I did a case study last year on what had happened in the Northern Territory and really did a deep dive, and some of the issues and what had happened was truly horrible, and I wish more people knew about those. But I think in that case, it's really hard for us to try and change the federal government when they've been told to change, and when it's almost like they speak one issue about this and it seems like, oh, they're going great in the right path, and then in a day later they go about something in the complete wrong way. So it's almost like is what they're saying just become tokenistic? Are they just doing it so they get more support? So I think it's like such a systematic issue where it's these like really hard conversations. And I think if they actually went out into the communities and talked to elders and talked to people like yourself, Grace, and asked, what would you do in this situation to help people have a better way of living, instead of punishing them for very systematic issues, I think, we would be a lot better as a country, and we would have a lot better ways of moving forward rather than spending $14 million on essentially just locking people up for the sake of it.
Abbey, go to you.
Yeah, I mean, Zara kind of smashed that answer, so I probably only add a little bit to it. But from a criminal justice point of view, I feel like the Australian government tends to put preventive measures in place and spend a lot of money on these preventive measures in like the Northern Territory, and other, I guess, highly concentrated Aboriginal communities. I'm not really sure. A lot of the time that it actually creates more problems for crime because they're over policed and they're out, I guess police are out looking for children up to no good, but really they're just being children. And this actually is a bit more, I guess, consequential when you actually put these kids into places like jails with older individuals, because they actually get worse and recidivism rates go up as well. So it's actually not good to do that because the outcomes are worse most of the time. So yeah, looking at it from a criminal perspective, a criminal justice point of view, they tend to do it just as preventative measures instead of actually dealing with the issue at hand.
Thanks, Abbey. Any other comments for this? I mean, I think it's a really important topic to be having, and something that I don't like to throw around kind of loose words and stuff, but often the government seems to be gaslighting people on what to do and how to act in these situations, and it becomes a bit of a blaming the communities before actually listening to and doing anything. So something needs to change for that. Any other questions for the moment? There's lots of comments also going on in the chat of people responding to some questions. There was one that I saw, and I think Harrison maybe you answered, from Alison. And Alison said, as a parent of a 10-year-old trans child who transitioned age 3, what youth advisory positions are open to 10-year-olds? Younger gender diverse kids are largely invisible. Many, like my child, would like their voices heard. I'll throw to the young people, I guess. I'll throw to anybody if they want to jump in on this question. Harrison, go ahead. And then Theo, we'll jump to you.
Yep, thanks, Angus. Alison, thank you so much for your question. As I replied in the chat, a lot of the so-called official positions that I've been able to find tend to have a minimum age of 12 or 13. But there's absolutely nothing stopping your child from going off and forming their own movement. What is absolutely fantastic about youth advocacy and all these types of issues is that you're able to sort of find a particular niche. And if it doesn't exist, find some friends who share a similar mind and start your own movement. And I'm sure I'm not the only person on this call who would say that if they were to need sort of support, like reach out to anybody on this call. We're all sort of experienced in youth advocacy, and we want to make sure that after we sort of age out of this young people sort of bracket, that young people younger than us will still continue to have their voices heard.
Thanks, Harrison. I'll throw it to you, Theo, because I saw you nodding, thus I haven't seen the official raised hand.
Sorry, I actually don't know how. I've been trying for hours. Anyway, though, I definitely felt at 10 years old that feeling of being like a queer young person that wants to be empowered, but the age 10 is like awkward because you're not like a 13-year-old yet, where like people want to hear like young people's voices, like you're a bit too young. But what I would suggest that I found really helpful for me is there are a lot of like theatre and advocacy young groups like House of Muchness and the Children's Party, that kind of, it's like how you're describing your child, of people as young as 8 that are interested in policy and having their voices heard, and theatre and all these different things that combine into really interesting programs. So I definitely suggest that for them. I'll pop them in the chat.
Thanks, Theo. And Jean?
I think that another thing that's useful is if you're just looking at representative roles, it can be tricky because, sort of, as Harrison was saying, like these sort of official institutions, it is like quite rigid and hard to get in. But when you look at the space of community organizing and activism, there's pretty much never an age limit. And I have found personally that's the space where I feel I can make a really great tangible change. And it was a really, really great entryway into advocacy and activism. So looking at like local action groups, looking at groups, even like Wear It Purple maybe, or those kind of spaces, they're always really, really welcoming of new people. And it's great having a community of all sorts of different ages and people around you who are all very passionate about this cause.
Awesome. Were there any, just to broaden that out, any other of the young people want to maybe make a point or a mention to anybody who may not know how to or what to do to get into advocacy, or any suggestions of, you know, where to look or how to find others? Tom? There should be some plugs here as well, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I'm sure my employer would probably be, Tom, you really got to plug us. I think as a young person, especially coming from regional, rural, remote Victoria, like Harrison was saying, you know, these opportunities can be not only harder to access, but also harder to find. Honestly, I'd say actually reaching out to organizations, whether it's just being on mailing lists and things like that, search up Youth Advocacy Victoria. Hopefully you'll find YACVIC. We've got a mailing list. We share a lot of opportunities, but also kind of going back to the age kind of thing. I've had the opportunity now to work with some local councils, and they're kind of trying to figure out, you know, do we want to allow people under the age of 12 to join this, whether it's a youth kind of advisory committee. With no exception so far, whenever they've decided to do that, my experience and their experience has been that it's only significantly beneficial to pretty much everyone. You're adding more voices to the conversation. The actual organization that's doing it is then getting, you know, more feedback when it comes to making policy. And yeah, everyone involved just kind of benefits from it. But yeah, there's my thoughts.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. Tahlia.
Hi, yeah, thanks. It's funny because I was going to say exactly what Tom said in terms of just offering a practical suggestion that really helped me, which was to join mailing lists of organizations. When you just get on Google and search, you know, if you've got something that you're passionate about, and you know those organizations, that.
Is that me that's frozen? No. Okay, because my computer said that I was having a weak internet. Sorry, I think you're frozen, Tahlia. Does anybody else from Amnesty want to do the plug at the end there, I think, was maybe coming?
I mean, I can probably jump on. So I guess if we're going to really go into a full-on plug for Amnesty, Amnesty has a wide range, I believe, of things that people can jump onto. Currently, we have a 16 and 17-year-old membership that people can get onto. And I know that kind of excludes the younger generation, but this doesn't mean that we still don't want to work with people of that age. And we actually have a few, I don't know what you'd call them, I guess, projects coming up that we actually want to get a few ideas from younger people and want to get them involved as well. So what you can do is you can actually email the YAG email address, and I can pop that into the chat later, so that if anyone wants to be involved or wants to see how their kids can get involved, literally just contact us and we'll reply as soon as we can with up and coming events that you can actually be involved with as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Zara?
Yeah, just really quickly to add, Alison, in your situation, I think you're providing a safe space and a great home for your child to proudly advocate. I know in my advocation journey so far, that's not even a word, but advocating journey so far, I should say, having a home where like I could advocate my thoughts and beliefs and my opinions, even if they were different to my parents, like having that safe space. And I think that really shifts into schooling and whatnot as well. So a lot of what we're saying, unfortunately, like there isn't a lot for very young people, but I think a great first place, which you've already provided, is having that home where people can advocate in safely.
Couldn't agree more, Zara. Beautifully said. And I'll just quickly wrap up before passing to you, Faith. I've seen you go off, just noting of the time. Thank you again to all of the young people and for your expertise and your time and for speaking with us. I always learn when I hear from young people and listen to them. And I think one of the key things that is the difference there is I'm not saying I'm talking to young people, because often it's older people talking at young people. I enjoy listening to young people. So I encourage you all, in whatever role and organisation that you work for, there are ways to get young people and youth voice included in decision making and in all elements of your organisation. Don't just assume that you need young people to do young people things. As I mentioned, they are experts and have lived and living experience in a wide range of different things and will add exponentially to anything that you do with them, and you'll continue to learn going forward. So thank you once again, and thank you for everyone for coming. And I'll just pass over to Faith to wrap up. But yeah, thanks again.
Thank you so much, Angus, for moderating the discussion. So many really important issues discussed. I'd like to, because I omitted to do so at the start, to thank DTP, so Andre and Rutabin for all of the organising, along with Angus, in bringing everyone together today, for all of the links that have been shared in the chat box for us all to learn. And I guess my just final point is that a lot of the issues that you all have spoken to today often are rooted in, really awful experiences that have happened in your community. And, thank you for sharing that, but also highlighting how you can use lived experience to push for change, to highlight what we need to do differently should things happen again. And thank you all so much for a lot of the key points that you have left us with about what we can go off and do now, having listened to your views and perspectives in what needs to change. So thank you, everyone. I have learned so much, as I always do, at these sessions. Thank you to everyone for giving up your time. And I'd also like to just give a little plug to the DTP in-person training that is being able to kickstart again following a little hiatus due to the COVID pandemic. So DTP have information that can be circulated about the next, which I believe, DTP can correct me on this, I think it's Sydney, and it's happening, and there is sign up for that happening now, and the chat box has just got the link to that. So thank you for posting that. Have a lovely rest of your day, everyone, and lovely to see you all on the screen. And thanks to everyone for the learning and contributions today. I'm sure these will be part of many continued conversations as we go through 2023. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
If there's anyone that would like to take a quick photo, I think Gavin wants to have a shot. So if there are people in the room who don't mind taking their face off, sorry. It's the end of the webinar. Taking the camera on, turning the camera on. We'll just take a quick group shot to mark the occasion. Again, this is not required, so please don't feel any pressure to. You're obviously welcome to go. But I will be taking a photo in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'll go one more in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Perfect. Thank you again. Thanks everyone, and have a great afternoon. I'll send them through, Gavin, don't worry.
Thanks, Angus. Take care, everyone. Lovely to see you all.